The account I want to tell you about today comes from an area known as Gresford. And it's a small village on the outskirts of Wrexham. And there is a report there of dog-like footprints that were left in the snow. The person who reported this to me stated in a snow-covered field he came upon enormous tracks which resembled those of a wolf, but the prints he found were considerably larger. I'd love that witness to contact me again, as we lost contact, and he told me that he had images of the wolf's prints, and as I say, we lost touch and I didn't get to see them. There is a second report from close to Gresford, and it's historical, and those reports are really, really important. Most people gloss over the older reports. If someone in 1790 sat down and wrote something out, it was incredibly important, because back then you had to be a scholar or have a decent amount of money for a record even to be made. Now, a record of an enormous wolf-like animal, as I said, dated back to the 1790s, when a stagecoach travelling between Denbigh and Wrexham was attacked and overturned by an enormous black beast, almost as long as the coach horses. This animal was described as terrifying, and it tore into one of the horses and killed it, while the other horse broke free from its harness and ran off into the night, whining in terror. The attack took place just after dusk, when a full moon was on the horizon. The moon that month seemed blood red due to the dust from a recent fire in the Hatchmere area, and it was called the Deadly Wolf Moon. The next year, in the winter of 91, a farmer went into his snow-covered field just 7 miles east of Gresford, and he saw enormous tracks that looked like those belonging to an overgrown wolf, a little bit like our witness. He followed the tracks with the blacksmith for 2 miles, and they led to a scene of absolute mutilation, which made the villagers in the area quake with fear. The tracks led into a farmstead where every single animal had either been literally torn to shreds or mortally wounded. One snow-covered field was just a lake of blood, dotted with the carcasses of sheep, cattle, and the farmer's dog. The farmer was found locked up inside his house in a terrible state. He wasn't harmed physically, but he was mentally terrified. He had barricaded himself in there after witnessing an enormous black animal that resembled a wolf ripping out the throat of the sheepdog. The animal had then gone for the farmer, but he just managed to run in the farmhouse in time. He bolted to the heavy oaken door and he rammed the table up to it, and all he had was a pitchfork. The farmer said the wolf pounded on the heavy oak door, almost knocking it off its hinges. The weird-looking animal then stood up on its hind legs like a human and looked in through the windows of the farmhouse. Its eyes were blue and seemed intelligent and also human-like. The beast foamed at the mouth as it peered in, and then bolted from the window to commit more carnage on the farm. Each of the sheep were left as pelts of wool with a head attached, lying flat on the snow like a woolen mat. The animal had even eaten sections of the animal's spines, and no one has ever seen a predator do something like that before. The church set up patrols in search of what was suspected to be a werewolf, and bands of villagers braved the freezing blizzard with lanterns, muskets, pitchforks, anything that they could find to fight off this ravenous beast, but only its tracks were ever seen. 7 years later, 2 men walking across the Bickerton Hills in Cheshire saw something that sent them running for their lives. The full moon had just risen, and as it peeped over the hilltop, the travellers saw the silhouette of an enormous, unidentified animal. The animal lifted its head, let out a blood-curdling howl, which echoed through the Cheshire Hills, and the 2 men rushed into an inn and refused to continue their journey until morning. At dawn on the following day, the mutilated bodies of 2 men were found in a wood just 5 miles from the inn. It didn't seem to be murder, because their bodies had been literally slashed to ribbons by something which had claws like knives. One of the victims had tried to cross a stream as he fled the scene of the slaying, and he'd been pounced on and eaten in the water. His head was never found and seemed to have been torn off. The head of the other victim was found stripped of its face and ears, and in other parts of the wood were strewn body parts. The jaws of the animal that killed the man must have been powerful, because the victim's skull had been cracked and splintered during the gruesome attack. Someone wrote an anonymous letter and posted it to the local minister, and the letter writer said the beast that had killed the men had been a werewolf, which had been on the loose in the area of Cheshire and Wales for over 100 years. The letter writer said the attack had happened during the eclipse of a moon, when the moon passes the Earth's shadow and seems to turn dark red, and he claimed that he'd heard the terrible screams of the men who were slaughtered by the animal. The writer told the minister to paint crosses on the doors of each dwelling in the village, because the werewolf was driven in by its bloodlust. It was said that a Welsh warlock, who had been burnt at the stake by the ancestors of the villagers in the year 1400, was possibly this werewolf. The attacks by the large black wolf gradually died out, and the people of Cheshire, or of Wales, breathed a sigh of release. But even 2 centuries later, attacks by a large unidentified animal were still being reported. In February 92, a Welsh newspaper called the Western Mail reported sightings of a strange bear-like animal that had been seen across Wales. In the north of the county, a farmer who had spotted the animal on the night of the full moon said he had afterwards found 2 of his full-grown 70-pound lambs ripped apart. One of the lambs was flattened, as if it had been run over by a farm tractor. There were around 70 further sightings between 92 and 94. The London Zoo gave the farmers in the area advice for trapping the unknown predator if they came across it. Cages baited with stakes and special trapdoors were installed on the farms in the hopes that the beast would venture into one of them. The thing did go into one cage, but when the door sprung shut, the animal pulled 2 steel bars apart and escaped. London Zoo blamed it on a lunatic who said they must have, got away from a hospital. But the farmer said the animal had pulled the bars apart itself. London Zoo experts said there is no known animal that could have done that, not even a grizzly bear. One pathetic explanation was that it was a wolverine on the loose, but the tracks left by the violent animal seemed to indicate that this was some large variety of wolf. An American expert on animal tracks said the prints left by the animal strongly resembled fossilized tracks left by a long extinct saber-toothed tiger. But the saber-toothed tiger has not roamed in Britain for over 2 million years. I know of lots and lots of canine reports from Crewe, Cheshire, Ellesmere Port, even up to Liverpool. Lots of them. A lot of the reports in the Delamere area are all canine in origin. From the pattern of the sightings made after 95, it would seem that the so-called Welsh werewolf is steadily moving eastwards towards Cheshire and Merseyside. Well, I would say that it's always been like that. That area of the country. Wales used to stretch as far up north past Cumbria, so all of it, Wales. And when you think about the historical reports of dogman-like creatures in Wales, they have a vast history of it. It goes right the way back to the 2nd century. People reporting these half men, half wolf-like animals. The killing fields are what interests me. These flattened out skin. So the fleece is flattened out, everything's gone apart from the head. That takes some enormous pressure to do that. To bite through an animal's spine, even a 70-pound lamb, would take some doing. And it reminds me of the animal attacks that are reported up in Skye in northern Scotland. One of those had its spine crunched by whatever was killing it. It's just absolutely terrifying to think that there are things out there in the British countryside that can kill an entire herd of cows and sheep. And believe me, Cows are not the little furry lovely things that you get from Disney. Cows, if you get into a field and they've got young, they will trample you to death. Quite a few people every year are killed by cows, believe it or not, in the UK. So anything, a dog, the cows would kick a dog to death if there was enough of them in the herd. What we're dealing with has got to be far bigger. You never mess about with a farm dog. So anything that takes out a farm dog, to me, is worth worrying about. And we should have been taught these things. Why don't we know these things? Whether you're English, Welsh, Scottish or Irish, why do we not know in our school system, in our history, that, in 1790 this was taking place? If I could have things my way, we'd be taught these things from a very early age. And that way, when we were seeing them and experiencing them, we wouldn't be as frightened by them. And I'm sure you'll agree. Good night, everyone.